like any vaccine. And as you know, I have a pretty strong view on vaccines. Being the Social Services Minister that introduced no jab, no play, what is important to understand with any of these vaccines, it does protect you, it does protect your family, but it also protects the community. And as is the case with any vaccine, there will be some individuals who, for quite precise medical reasons, there can be issues with a particular vaccine. They and their safety and their health depends on the vaccine's take-up more broadly in the community. That's how they get protected. And this is an important part of our vaccine strategy, not just on COVID-19, but more broadly. So we will be seeking its most widespread application, as we do with all important vaccines. But Paul, you may want to talk about how those practices are followed, and we'll be doing that, of course, in partnership with states and territories.
Thank you, PM. So, of course, the first will be a voluntary call for people, and I'm sure there will be long queues, socially distanced, of course, for this vaccine. It will be incredibly welcomed by many. It will be the absolute ticket to get back to some sort of normal society and the things that we all love and enjoy. So I think there will be a very strong take-up of this vaccine. Of course, there will be some that, for medical reasons, as the PM has said, may not be able to take the vaccine. But there'll be very strong campaigns to encourage people, and we've had experience before of linking vaccination with other programs, and all of those things will be looked at over time. But first thing we have to have is a vaccine that works, that is safe, and can be rolled out in large numbers. That's the key point.
We're here today to announce that we've signed a letter of intent with AstraZeneca, which will enable to Australia to access, should it be successful, the vaccine for COVID-19 here in Australia, manufactured here in Australia, distributed free to 25 million Australians in the event that those trials prove successful. There are around 160 different vaccine projects around the world today. Some of those are well advanced, like the AstraZeneca proposal, and that they're turning up with the University of Oxford. Others are still on their way and looking good too, like in the University of Queensland. There are many others, and Professor Brendan Murphy is heading up an expert panel which is advising the government on the other programs and the other projects that we can take positions on to ensure that Australia is incredibly well placed to ensure that Australians can emerge quickly in the event that a vaccine is developed.
As a result of the current pandemic, the Bank of England has cut their interest rate twice over the last couple of weeks to help stimulate the UK economy. The Bank of England has also extended their quantitative easing program and announced a new term funding scheme for small businesses. In this video, we will cover why the Bank of England cut their interest rates, what quantitative easing is and how it works, and how all of these measures affect UK consumers like you and me. I will also discuss my thoughts on as to all these measures might fuel inflation or even hyperinflation in the long term. So, let's get into it. On the 11th of March, the Bank of England cut their interest rate for the first time since August 2016, and they cut it by 50 basis points from 0.75% to 0.25%. They also announced a new term funding scheme for small businesses. Last week, the Bank of England cut their rates even further to 0.1%, which is the lowest rate in history. They also extended their quantitative easing program by £200 billion and prolonged their new term funding scheme. All of these measures are aimed at stimulating the UK economy. To understand exactly how these work, let's look at each of them in more detail. The Bank of England base rate is the interest rate. So, are all these measures going to lead to inflation or even hyperinflation in the long term? Inflation happens when central banks print a lot of money, increasing the money supply in circulation and rendering money essentially worthless. This is what happened in Zimbabwe and Venezuela, and why, when you look at newspapers from when it happened back in the day, you can see photos of people going to the supermarket and the grocery store with wheelbarrows worth of cash because cash essentially became worthless. Let me tell you why I think that this is not likely to happen due to quantitative easing. This is because the majority of the money that is created now is only created digitally as digital money, and only the smallest proportion will actually make it out into the real economy. At the same time, because consumers and businesses are so uncertain at the moment, they're hoarding money and reducing spending. So the increased money supply through the central bank is actually making up for a reduction from consumers and businesses. If on the flip side, the central bank had announced quantitative easing in a booming time, that will almost certainly lead to inflation and perhaps even hyperinflation. If we look at what happened in the financial crisis after 2008, many rounds of quantitative easing were used by many of the central banks to stimulate the economy. Inflation rates thereafter were actually between 1.5 and 2%, which is exactly what the central banks target for sustainable economic growth. Therefore, I do not think that there's a risk of inflation in the long term.
Central banks around the world have injected money into the economy at a record pace to try to fight a global recession triggered by the coronavirus pandemic.
Just getting word from the Federal Reserve.
Bombshell announcement from the Federal Reserve.
It is an absolutely historic week, both in terms of the speed of Fed purchases and, of course, the magnitude.
Since mid-March, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet has ballooned from $4 trillion to around $7 trillion, equal to about one-third of the value of the entire American economy.
A new CNBC survey showing that market participants expecting trillions more in stimulus from both the central bank and Congress.
At the same time, governments have enacted record amounts of fiscal stimulus to boost economies stalled by the pandemic. The infusion of cash into the financial system has renewed concerns that inflation could surge.
As Milton Friedman said, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. If you believe that, you look at the central bank balance sheets exploding right now, and you say there's going to be inflation.
Supply shocks have driven up prices for some goods over the past few months. Yet recent history suggests inflation is more likely to stay low for a long time, as unemployment remains near record high levels and consumer spending is subdued.
While there certainly is quite a lot of disruption to the supply side of the economy, that's likely to be dominated by the huge hit to aggregate demand.
So how will trillions of dollars of economic stimulus affect the outlook for inflation? Inflation refers to an increase in the prices of goods or services over time. One well-known measure of inflation in the U.S. is called the Consumer Price Index, or CPI.
The CPI is about the prices that we pay for services and goods and housing and rent.
Economists say some inflation is healthy for the economy. When the economy is growing, more consumers and businesses are outspending money on goods and services. This increase in demand results in higher prices. Demand is an important factor in the outlook for inflation. Generally, when unemployment is high and consumer demand is weak, inflation is low. Another factor that affects inflation is commodity prices. If oil prices rise because there's a cut in production, gas prices might increase too. Consumer and business expectations about prices are another piece of the inflation puzzle. If a lot of people expect prices will rise in the future, they might spend more now, ultimately causing inflation.
The level of actual inflation that we get will be pretty heavily influenced by the inflation rate that actors in the economy, so households, businesses, consumers, workers, investors, expect to prevail.
Like many other central banks around the world, the Fed targets a 2% yearly inflation rate. At that rate, a cup of coffee that costs $2 this year would cost $2.04 next year. Not quite enough to break the bank.
Also had in 2008, but simultaneously, at that time, bank credit was shrinking, and the banks were shrinking credit creation. But in 2020, bank credit was simultaneously being boosted. In fact, much more even than the Fed, which makes sense. That's what happens in growth terms. And the second reason why we know this is exactly what happened is because they hired BlackRock. The Federal Reserve officially, look it up, hired BlackRock to go out and buy all these many assets from the private sector. And of course, they bought things like corporate bonds from the private sector, large scale. The same, the ECB did the same. Now, when I saw this, I was completely shocked. By the time I had the data, it was around May 2020. I had the data and I was shocked. And I realized, okay, this will create significant inflation because the economy was growing. Bank credit was already expanding at 5-6%. It had not contracted. And they were now injecting this additional money, and so there's a massive explosion in bank credit.
How much they inject?
Well, it's in the trillions of dollars, trillions of euros. And you see, it happened, of course, at the time when simultaneously they restricted supply. And if you boost demand so much by injecting new money into the economy, while you restrict supply, of course, you're going to push up prices. Suddenly, there's much more demand for existing output, goods and services. So general consumer price inflation, which we haven't had significantly since the 70s, was created by the central banks on purpose. I mean, they said it beforehand, we want to create inflation, they did it, and then it was clear we were going to get significant inflation. So I warned, 18 months later, it takes more than a year, 18 months later you get significant inflation, which means double-digit inflation. And that's exactly what we got. So it was a central bank policy. It had nothing to do with, President Biden says it's Putin's price hike. It's complete nonsense.
That means that doesn't matter what war started in Europe, doesn't matter anything else. It was exactly, the only thing was Federal Reserve policy.
Exactly. If you check the timing, anyway, the war, when the war in Europe, February 2022, started, that was already too late. Inflation had already picked up significantly. The timing doesn't work. Also, oil prices, energy prices, gas prices, the timing doesn't work to explain that inflation. Now, the thing is, interestingly, if you check the 1970s, where they tell us the same story, they tell us, 1970s, well, there was an inflationary period because there was this war in the Middle East, and then OPEC, the oil-producing countries, Arab countries, had a boycott, and they didn't sell oil to Europe and America. That's why we had an oil price shock, and we had inflation. That's the official story.
Okay.
But the timing doesn't work, just the same as now. And you look at what the central banks did, they did the same thing. It was also central bank created.
Mm-hmm. We'll come to this a little later.
What we know is that we will end up with many more unemployed, and particularly also people in the grey economy, which are not counted for, who lose their jobs. So we will see definitively a lot of anger already now, but probably increased by the end of the year, because this crisis will be with us until we really have found a remedy. So we have to prepare for a more angry world. And how to prepare? It means to take the necessary action to create a fairer world, to see that we provide everybody with decent access to the health system, that we make sure that those people who are really left behind, and I'm not speaking only on national levels, I'm speaking also internationally. If I see now the tragedy in some of the emerging countries like South Africa, like some countries in East Asia, I think it's all, I don't have too many remedies. The remedies have to be discussed through dialogue by the stakeholders of our global system. But I just see the need for such a dialogue, and I see the need for action. I see the need for a great reset.
Right. Because that is a different scenario. Namely, the central planners will introduce all sorts of further central planning measures if they want to, if inflation becomes a problem. The parallels are there. Queues, big queues, well, that's also what they had in the central planning Soviet Union, big queues everywhere. People not allowed to do certain trades because the government is forbidding them. Well, go to Stalinist Soviet Union.
Price controls.
And so that's the next one I was going to say, price controls, you see, comes next. Of course, as the COVID agenda smoothly morphs into the climate change prevention agenda, and we've got these 2030 targets for all sorts of things, CO2 emissions, we have a problem whereby we're supposed to switch all the cars to electric cars, but the electricity supply in the world is not large enough to do this.
Right.
Well, that's not a problem.
Why?
If you look at the right comparison, and it's not Weimar Germany, it is Stalinist type Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, they had cars, But not everyone had cars.
Exactly.
If you were a member of the Politburo and the party cadre, then you had a car.
You paint
If you were an ordinary person, well, public transport is good enough for you, isn't it?
So what you see behind me is, from my personal view, one of the most iconic mines in the entire mining industry. We move roughly 150 million tons of earth every single year to make sure that we always have access to our ore body.
Copper mines, like this one in Utah, are on the front line of America's transition to clean energy. This site, owned and operated by mining giant Rio Tinto, produces roughly 200,000 metric tons of copper annually. Global demand for copper, a major component of EVs, is expected to almost double from 25 million metric tons to nearly 49 million metric tons by 2035. But miners face a multitude of issues as they ramp up production, not least of which includes mitigating environmental damage, addressing the concerns of the local stakeholders, and operating in remote regions of the world.
We're definitely part of the energy transition solution. The challenge is, of course, we have to provide the materials to meet this increasing demand.
Mining is also difficult and potentially dangerous work. Here at Rio Tinto's Kennecott mining operation on the outskirts of Salt Lake City, 3/4 of a mile beneath the surface, miners work around the clock digging for copper. That material is then loaded onto 350-ton trucks and hauled to the surface.
You know, when you first get on up here, you get in this thing and it feels like, oh my gosh, I'm driving a house around. But after a couple of weeks, you kind of get used to it because everything up here is so big.
Adjacent to the mine, a smelter and refinery help process the extracted material into 99.9% pure copper.
There's going to be a real problem with this transition over the next 10 years is that it is very, very hard for these companies to even maintain the level of production that they have at the moment.
Based in the UK, Rio Tinto is one of the world's largest mining companies, with projects in 35 countries. In addition to its 17 iron ore mines in Western Australia that produce material used in steel, its products include aluminum, diamonds, and boron, a component in fertilizer and smartphones. Historically, miners have been known for their environmental impact, but today are increasingly recognized as crucial players in the transition to green energy.
Reconciliation Week, and old mate Rio Tinto celebrated by excavating an ancient Aboriginal site, and boy did they have a blast.
The company detonated explosives last Sunday, which tore down 2 ancient rock shelters. The sacred sites date back 46,000 years.
Dukin Gorge caves in WA's Pilbara region were destroyed last Sunday to make way for a mine expansion after the company reportedly received ministerial consent.
They're destroying our history, not just as Aboriginal people, they're destroying Australian history, you know, and human history.
Rio Tinto blew up a sacred site that showed evidence of human occupation 46,000 years ago, which is both an incomprehensibly large amount of time and also how long 2020 has felt. Despite reportedly being told at least 6 years ago that the site was of the highest archaeological significance, Rio Tinto have said they are sorry.
I'd like to say very sorry to the Putu, Kunti, Karama and Pinakura people. You know, this has rocked me personally, and it was never our intent to cause distress.
I mean, who could possibly have known that destroying a place of immeasurable significance would cause such a gosh darned hullabaloo? Well, maybe Rio Tinto, considering that they funded a documentary that expressed just how important this site is to the community.
Our ancestors from this country have left behind their footprints and walked all over this land.
So what's Rio Tinto's excuse? Did they forget their map? Did they get the wrong cave? Did they give the intern free rein over the explosives for a day?
We've obviously had some misunderstanding. We thought we had a shared understanding of the future of the caves, that they would in fact be mined as part of our normal mining sequence.
For more on this, let's talk to Briggs.
Oh, hey Chuck, how are you?
Good. Briggs, where are you?
Well, what we've got here used to be the Rio Tinto headquarters. And then we had a little bit of a misunderstanding about its past. But I don't want to think about that, Chuck. I want to think about the future.
Right. And what does that future look like?
Well, I'm no geologist, Chuck, but I'm going to say that it looks like a pile of rubble.
Right. So why are you doing this?
Well, I thought it was only right that I destroy something sacred to white Australia. You know, I tried to blow up the ashes, but blowing up the ashes only creates more ashes. They're already ashes. So I was thinking to myself, what do Australian politicians hold more sacred than cricket? Then it hit me. Mining profits.
Right, so what is your reaction to the reports that Rio Tinto was aware of the site's significance 6 years ago?
Oh, mate, 6 years ago, it was only 45,994 years old, mate. We could talk about this all day, but why don't we hear from an expert, somebody who cares about the land? Here's Scott Morrison at the National Press Club on Sorry Day, the same day that we heard about this destruction.
The principle of caring for country, a principle that Indigenous Australians have practiced for tens of thousands of years. We must not borrow from generations in the future from what we cannot return to them.
How could I possibly say it better than that, Chuck? For 46,000 years, generation after generation has handed this down until us, until now.
Okay, but is the answer really excavating their corporate headquarters?
Yes. It's an exploratory mission, Chuck. You see, what used to be a heartless mining corporation is now my Indigenous art installation. Job done.
Thank you very much, Briggs. Good to see you.
On the most pressing challenge we have ever faced, repairing our planet. The shared goals for our generation are clear. Together, we must protect and restore nature, clean our air, revive our oceans, build a waste-free world, and fix our climate. And we must strive to do all of this in a decade. If we achieve these goals, by 2030, our lives won't be worse, and we won't have to sacrifice everything we enjoy. Instead, the way we live will be healthier, cleaner, smarter, and better for all of us. The global response to the COVID-19 pandemic and the funds flowing into the economic recovery demonstrate how much can be achieved when those in positions of power come together and decide to act. We built hospitals overnight, repurposed factories, poured billions into the search for a vaccine and better treatments. And we've been inspired by heroes emerging in every community across the world. Young people no longer believe that change is too difficult. They've witnessed the world turn on its head. They believe that the climate crisis and the threat to our biodiversity deserves our full attention and ambition. And they're right. So now is the time for each one of us to show leadership.
The Earthshot Prize.
The Earthshot Prize, David, is the most prestigious global environmental prize there's ever been. And the plan is to really galvanize and bring together the best minds, the best possible solutions to fixing and tackling some of the world's greatest environmental challenges.
And each year there will be how many?
So we've got 5 Earthshots for every year for the next 10 years. They are reviving the oceans, restoring and protecting nature, fixing the climate, clean air, and a waste-free world.
So in 10 years, there will have been 50 different ideas that are out there doing things to the planet.
It's a hugely ambitious target, but I do think that positivity and that finding ways through this is better than saying, you know, it's all doom and gloom, we're all going to, you know, perish. I think we've got to harness our ingenuity and our ability to invent some of this out. Global wildlife populations declined by over half. Africa's rapidly growing human population is predicted to more than double by 2050, a staggering increase of 3.5 million people per month. There is no question that this increase puts wildlife and habitats under enormous pressure. We're going to have to work much harder and think much deeper if we are to ensure that human beings and the other species of animal with which we share this planet can continue to coexist. When we look back, we have a mixed track record in this regard, but I'm always optimistic when I observe how young people in particular, all over the world, are motivated to reverse the trends of the past.
Today we are a $3 trillion coalition, guided by our independent advisory group of world-renowned sustainability academics and experts. We're really looking forward to being in New York with our founder, Prince Harry, the Duke of Sussex, to celebrate everything that we have achieved together so far and sharing our vision for what's to come next.
Today, we dive into a story that's not just about travel. It's about changing the very fabric of how we experience the world, how we connect with communities, and how we preserve our planet for future generations. We'll explore the groundbreaking work of Travalyst, an initiative spearheaded by Prince Harry that's set to make waves at New York's Climate Week as it celebrates its 5th anniversary. But this is more than just a look back at the past 5 years. It's a journey into the future of sustainable tourism and the transformative impact Travalyst is poised to make. So let's get started. When Prince Harry first conceived the idea of Travalyst, he wasn't just thinking about travel, he was envisioning a new way of interacting with the world. Launched in 2019, Travalyst began as a bold vision to reshape the travel industry by bringing together some of the world's largest and often competing travel and technology brands. These were companies that, under normal circumstances, might have seen each other as rivals. But under the banner of Travalyst, they united with a common goal to bring sustainable tourism into the mainstream. In those early days, the vision was ambitious but clear. Prince Harry, through his extensive travels and humanitarian work, had seen firsthand the impact that tourism can have on both communities and the environment. He recognized that while travel can be a force for good, bringing economic opportunities to remote regions and fostering cultural exchange, it can also have devastating effects if not managed responsibly. Overcrowded tourist destinations, environmental degradation, and the erosion of local cultures were just some of the challenges that needed to be addressed. The idea behind Travalyst was simple, yet revolutionary. Create a coalition of industry leaders, guided by an independent advisory group of sustainability experts and academics, to develop and promote best practices in sustainable tourism. This coalition would work together to create a global movement that would transform the travel industry from within.
We're now just 5 years away from the 2030 deadline for the Sustainable Development Goals, the global blueprint for creating a more resilient planet and, quite literally, saving ourselves. But it's quite clear we're not progressing as quickly as needed, and the economic impacts are only growing. These realities leave us with a choice: find practical solutions to climate change, or accept the massive financial and human losses that it's causing. I think we all agree that the latter isn't the answer.
% of the companies that come out of ours are directly aligned with the UN Sustainable. 89% of the companies that come out of ours are directly aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. If you're from MIT, you should be damn proud of that, because that's what we're about. We're addressing the world's greatest challenges, not doing, some cryptocurrency company like FTX that kind of rips people off. 89.
The United Nations came up with 17 Sustainable Development Goals in 2015. They're meant to be achieved by 2030, and I can say that we're way off the mark at the moment. Sustainability is still a lot talked about, but we see very little action from individuals, organizations, and even countries. So unfortunately, in 2024, I don't think we're getting anywhere, which is really the gist of my talk. Right? Well, I'm hoping that all of us as individuals, as leaders of business organizations, right, we can come together and think about how we can collectively pool our resources and efforts to make digital sustainability a priority, so that by pooling our resources, pooling our efforts, it makes the attainment of digital sustainability goals it's easier and more efficient.
I enjoy very much all these conversations that we had with Hamid, Leah, and everyone. And congratulations actually to the REACH teams for making it to this place. It seems it's an amazing program. I like to hear more. It's the first time I come across the program. I'm managing director at the Stanford Sustainability Accelerator. But before I go to explain what we are building here, I wanted to give you an overview of how it all came about here at Stanford and the Doerr School of Sustainability. I don't know if many of you know about the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability. How many are? Okay, all right. So let's explain a little bit of the background. So some of you may know that Stanford is made of 6 different schools: the School of Engineering, Business, Medicine, Education, Humanity and Sciences, and Law, until 2022, when the Doerr School of Sustainability was, hello? Does it? A little bit of a delay. Yeah. So until 2022, when the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability was created, and this was a new school in over 70 years. So for 70 years, nothing has happened, and in the last, and then it was created the Stanford Sustainability School, which is 3 years old only. And that was propelled by one of the biggest donations to an academic institution. It was 1.1 billion given by a venture capitalist investor, John Doerr, and his wife Anne, and this is why the name of the Doerr School of Sustainability. This was an all kind of campus effort. All the schools came together with this common vision of creating a future where humans and nature thrives in concert and perpetuity. And this requires reimagining academia and its value to society.
It's never easy, even for governments, to resolve a conflict of major interests, least of all when a nationally profitable enterprise is confronted by a popular conservation movement. There have been and there are many of these conflicts in front of us now, and more are on the horizon. And we have a massive job of research and education to do. Therefore, I think it's important for every faction in conservation to realize that we are all part of the same popular conservation movement, and that in spite of differences of emphasis within the movements, our only hope of making any impression on public, industrial, or government opinion and outlook is to do our homework and to do our best to work together.
into the future of our city. A sustainable future that we've been planning for some time. Melbourne, events capital, cultural hub, sports mecca, a famously livable city. We have a vision to become one of the world's most sustainable cities and to be carbon neutral by 2020. More than 70% of our city residents live in high-rise apartment buildings. We have created programs to work with these residents to reduce water and energy usage, as well as manage waste and recycling. The 1200 Buildings program helps commercial building owners retrofit their properties with modern, energy-efficient technologies. If 1200 buildings improve their energy efficiency, the greenhouse gas savings would help achieve the city's carbon neutral goal. Preparing for the future requires investment right now, and we are unlocking funds through our environmental upgrade agreements for building owners who are ready to retrofit. We also lead by example. We are upgrading several of our council buildings. The amount of energy needed to light the town hall will be halved. We built Council House 2, Australia's first new 6-star Green Star office design. Council House 2 led the way in environmentally sustainable design, creating a model for similar buildings. But a city is more than just its buildings. Melbourne has an extensive network of dedicated bike lanes, and Swanston Street, the city's main street, is closed to car traffic. We encourage walking and the use of our public transport for work and city visits. We are also demonstrating sustainable practice. Solar panels at Queen Victoria Market demonstrate local clean energy generation. At Melbourne Town Hall, we are delivering new waste solutions, producing organic matter for use in our parks and gardens. We are supporting the city's vibrant hospitality precincts to install similar technology. We recognise Melbourne's ancient role as a water catchment. In modern Melbourne, we are building water tanks and underground stormwater harvesting systems, as well as encouraging recycled water plants in the city's major buildings. Our urban forest strategy is our tree plan for the future, adapting to a changing climate. We are trialling cool roofs, green walls and facades, and providing technical guidelines to property owners. Our city is a sum of many communities and precincts. In Docklands, green commercial buildings dominate the landscape. We are also working to ensure these communities have open spaces, sustainable food and services. Our journey has begun, but we must accelerate action if we are to achieve a carbon neutral city by 2020. We can't do it alone. Melbourne's progress involves everyone: politicians, planners, residents, businesses, workers and visitors. Our city is renowned as being one of the world's most livable. We will continue to innovate to make it one of the world's most sustainable too.
This year is a watershed. Policy is hardening, and unless people speak up, things will be set in concrete. There will be legislative changes and very drastic changes to the way life is at the moment. And you can see that in the states, the territory and the federal government all now aligned to fairly radically push people off the homelands. Once it was only in the Northern Territory, but now we're seeing this in Western Australia and in South Australia following that same blueprint. And the country at large doesn't know about this. So for people from those regions to come to Canberra and say, what about us? That's why it's so urgent.
Now, when you were speaking at Redfern, you spoke about the fading memory of land rights. What exactly did you mean by that?
Well, what we are ignoring is the legislative changes driven by federal government are undermining the meagre land rights that have been established in the past. So in the minds of many non-Indigenous Australians, Aboriginal people are still on vast amounts of country. But the truth is, soon a federal minister in Canberra will be able to bypass land councils, traditional owners, and virtually work with corporate Australia on what is carving up the real estate. It is about a development vision for Northern Australia in particular, but other regions as well, that will drive people off country. And it's this pattern that we saw beginning in the Northern Territory of starving people of essential services. So if you turn off the water and the power and you say we don't have money for education in these places, the pressure on families is very dramatic. And my warning is, what about these fellow citizens who are going to be emptied of their communities, where thousands of families will actually be driven off country, pushed towards towns that have no plan for them anyway?
It's just the land of extremes. You got too much, you got nothing.
East of Tibooburra, in the far northwest corner of New South Wales, lies Narriara Station. It's a vast property, more than 150,000 hectares, 1,300 square kilometres of what's known as the Channel Country. Narriara's northern boundary flanks the Queensland border. Its eastern fence line extends into no man's land.
It's not far off the size of the ACT, so it's a very sizable patch of country in the northwest of New South Wales.
For more than a century, Narriara was owned by the O'Connor family. In June 2020, it was sold to the New South Wales government, the largest acquisition of private land for a national park in the state's history. The transition from private to public ownership is well down the track. Narriara Homestead sits at the end of a rough and dusty road. Lord of this modest manor is Bill O'Connor.
How's things, mate?
He's lived in this harsh and remote environment for 84 years.
You've got some rain out there on the windscreen.
Starting already.
Yeah,
just
yeah,
a little bit,
yeah.
just a little bit.
Conference room right now, but instead you're in a town, someplace in a country where a lot of people live on very little. Imagine that you're the mayor of this town, the leader of this community. Your people mostly don't have electricity. If they do, it's in the form of a 12-volt car battery and a couple of wires. The kids can't study at night. Now, you're an enterprising mayor, so you've applied for and won a grant. It might be a grant from a philanthropic institution, or perhaps it's part of a larger grant that came to your country from the government of a wealthier country. Now, you could use it maybe to buy a diesel generator and get some rudimentary electrical power to your people, but that's dirty, it's expensive, and now you are exposing your people to fuel risk. So you think back a couple years back about this company that came to your town and almost invested. They walked away because it was slightly too expensive to connect to the grid from your town. So you call this company back and you talk to them, and they run the numbers again with your grant. And guess what? It's a viable business for them with the grant mixed in. And your people could get reliable, clean power. Now, all of this flies in the face of normal aid. Putting charitable money and commercial money into the same pot and giving it to a company, it makes people really nervous. So guess what? It actually happens all the time. It's called, if it's done right, it's win-win, and it's called blended finance. Now, blended finance is the use of funding, catalytic funding, from either a public or a philanthropic source to increase private investment in sustainable development. Now, let me talk a little bit about where you see it. At Convergence, we've recorded over 750 individual transactions that have closed in the market. And all told, they represent over $170 billion of business done. The transactions most frequently happen in sub-Saharan Africa, about half of all of the deals. Next most frequent destination for blended finance is Latin America at 20% of the deals. The sectors most frequently targeted by blended finance are energy, which is basically renewables, at about 30%, financial services at about 25%, and agriculture at 15%. Now, looking at the sectors brings up a really important point. The reason these sectors, and not health and education, show up so frequently in our statistics is because for blended finance to work, there has to be an ability to generate revenues. In other words, the initiative has to make some money. It doesn't have to be a lot. After all, the principle behind blended finance is to bend the economics disproportionately toward the party that needs to make a commercial return. But some money has to flow from the concept. Likewise, while blended finance can create a cash stream and make a transaction less risky, it can't cover for a business model that fundamentally fails to capture economic value and to monetize it. If a project is small, risky, unstructured, and unlikely to make a profit, then a straight grant is probably what you're looking at. In the same vein, blended finance deals tend to show up more frequently in lower middle income countries, about 55% of the deals we've seen, and much less frequently, about 26% of the time, in the least developed economies. And that makes sense because, again, you have to have underlying revenues. And if you take a small amount of catalytic money, you can create an investable opportunity in a higher income country much more readily. And that leaves grant resources to be used in a more pure form in least developed economies.
I'm Dr. Hubert Danso. I'm the CEO and Chairman of Africa Investor, an institutional infrastructure investment company. I also chair the African Green Infrastructure Investment Bank, and I also chair the African Sovereign Wealth and Pension Fund Leaders Forum. I'm also a member of President Macron's Finance and Private Sector Task Force for this new Financial Pact Summit. And as a consequence, we work very closely with key leading global asset owner platforms, the net zero asset owner being one of the most prominent. When you look at their climate financing needs, we're talking about $23 trillion according to the latest data. So, and the majority of that financing needs to come from the private sector. It needs to be private capital, which is distinct from other markets in the world. So there needs to be a wholesale shift in the way that the multilateral development banks catalyze that financing. I think the MDBs have not really been able to mobilize private capital at scale, particularly for emerging markets and developing countries, but to optimize the balance sheets to crowd in private capital at scale. They've got to be able to subordinate and de-risk the participation of long-term institutional capital. And there's got to be a much better alignment and a much stricter focus around the nationally determined contribution projects, the projects that the governments have said these are our priority projects that need private capital. MDB should really focus on helping to de-risk private capital's participation in those particular transactions, as opposed to just seeking to provide their own instruments, which in some cases are in direct conflict or competition with what we could do as the private sector. I mean, it's unprecedented that we now have to mobilize these tens of trillions of dollars, all sort of within a 7 to 10 year period. So I think we need to redefine and really help the multilateral development banks understand exactly what we need to be able to deploy capital at scale and ensure that there's a legal and regulatory environment in the markets that we participate that can absorb and grow this capital at speed.
I'm super excited to have you guys here this morning, and I hope you have a lovely breakfast and an informative session. The whole theme of blended finance and this is important, and I'm really glad we're here to partner with Convergence and CDH to do this work, because this is a really big part of how we mobilize capital for sustainable growth in the continent.
We educate, guide, and advise all the different organizations and the types of organizations in this room to blend and to mobilize capital.
How do we allocate capital to reduce the risk for the investors, but also ensure that we keep profitability levels that are attractive to the private sector?
I hope that this is going to be the beginning of many, many more of these interactions as we go forward.
Business in Rwanda. In this episode, we focus on Rwanda's efforts to attract green financing as it strives to attain its target of building a carbon-neutral and climate-resilient economy by 2050. I'm your host, Tessie Carmen. Rwanda has set an ambitious climate action agenda to build the country's resilience and foster green growth. To achieve these goals, the country needs investments totaling $11 billion. The Kigali International Finance Center recently launched the Sustainable Finance Roadmap, an instrument that is meant to help Rwanda become a leading Pan-African hub for local, regional, and international sustainable finance.
This roadmap for Kigali International Financial Center is very important because it looks at 3 pillars. One, how do we attract sustainable finance focused investors? How do we put in place the infrastructure required to attract that? And that speaks to issues around taxonomy. And 3, how do we build skills and competencies around sustainable finance or ESG investing? So it's to be able to attract the investments. One, you need to have the infrastructure in place, you need to have the skills, and then you need to attract the capital. So it speaks to those 3 key pillars.
The Sustainable Finance Roadmap contains 3 strategic objectives that will help address existing gaps around green investing in Rwanda.
Limited skills of people who have the knowledge, the experience around ESG investing across different subsectors of our financial sector, be it banking, be it insurance, be it capital markets. We see that gap. So it's a gap that we need to respond to.
The future of the environment and businesses are closely interlinked. Climate change now poses the biggest and most likely threat to the global economy over the next decade. Market and reputational risk, as well as regulatory pressure on companies linked to unsustainable soft commodity production, means current business practices need to change, with many already exposed to potential stranded assets. So how do we redirect private capital to avoid forest and biodiversity loss, improve the well-being of local communities, and ensure the agricultural sector thrives through profitable business models? Combining the capabilities of banks, governments, and agribusinesses through blended finance instruments is key to transforming the way we finance sustainable land use. The world's first landscapes bond, issued by the Tropical Landscapes Finance Facility and developed by BNP Paribas and ADM Capital, is financing a sustainable natural rubber plantation on degraded land in Indonesia. In the inaugural transaction, a $95 million bond was issued to capital market investors through structured notes of varying tenors and rank. This successful deal helped an Indonesian natural rubber producer scale up production and yield while setting aside part of the concessions for forest restoration, ecosystem conservation, and community programs, with jobs provided to local workers for farming the rubber plantations. An offtake agreement was also negotiated, guaranteeing the sale of the majority of rubber grown. In such a pioneering deal, some form of risk mitigation is required. This is where public finance was crucial, with a partial credit guarantee offering security to some bondholders in case of default, helping broaden the investor base and lowering the overall funding cost of the transaction. The success of this project will increase the appetite of other banks, investors, and agribusinesses to finance projects that combine financial performance with clear environmental and social benefits.
We cannot achieve sustainable development if we can't finance it. And for this, we have to bring both the public and the private sector on board.
There is a need for urgent action and mobilization of private sector capital.
What makes us unique is that we have the access to the farmer. The UN environment gives us the possibility to provide extra incentives for the farmer to change his behavior day to day.
These and other successful blueprints can then be replicated across the agricultural and financial sectors, reducing the levels of public finance required and turning sustainable agriculture into an investable business proposition.
Julie. She likes to spend the holidays visiting her Uncle George on his farm. She's heard that the entire region where her uncle lives has just been selected by UNESCO as a designated biosphere reserve. Julie isn't too sure about that. What exactly is a UNESCO biosphere reserve? Is it something like an Indian reservation? And will they be putting a fence around it? Then she probably wouldn't be allowed to roam around the woods and fields anymore. And Uncle George might have to get rid of his tractor and use a carriage instead. Uncle George can put his niece's mind at rest. He explains that a biosphere reserve helps humans and the environment to get along better, and it does so without damaging the lovely landscape. It doesn't need fences, just well-balanced interaction between humans and nature. Uncle George has also discovered some advantages for himself, such as opportunities to make his farm even more profitable, and this in ways that benefit nature and the region. For Uncle George, not much has changed, and Julie can continue to explore the woods and fields. But something is different. Julie is curious to find out what. The Biosphere Reserve now offers lots of new activities. Julie and other visitors can explore the area with a ranger or follow adventure trails to learn exciting facts about animals and plants. Of course, the local hotels, restaurants and tradespeople benefit from the visitors, so any doubts among the population are quickly dispelled. Many are seeing the advantages and forming corporations so that they can also participate actively in the development of the Biosphere Reserve. Julie thinks biosphere reserves are great and is almost a bit envious of her uncle because he gets to work where other people spend their holidays. And because businesses can develop so well in biosphere reserves, she might find a job there herself one day. Why not visit a biosphere reserve near you sometime? There are more of them than you think.